January 16, 2021. We're going to pick up where we left off. We left off in the last video of the rise of America, approaching up to the Revolutionary War, what was going on. We touched base on the issues going on with Great Britain, the Tories, what the state of the world was in that time, and what was going on around the world, how all the world's nations at that time and totalitarian dictators were vying for world control and domination, and how America was at a point as well of being pulled into the vacuum of that as Great Britain was attempting to make its move of establishing as well a kingdom here, what would have been in America. And how that was what led to the American patriots rising up because they realized what was coming. They feared the potential likelihood that they all would wind up being enslaved, as what was going on in Great Britain, with the large massive population of white slaves, of the Irish and Scottish working the mines. They knew that King George had his mind set. The farming districts in the South, being controlled by the black African slaves, were producing huge profits for him. He was now focusing at things of minerals and other things, copper, brass, and they knew what was coming, so they were planning for the revolt. And now what we're going to do is we're going to pick up from that point there, and we're going to go into the Revolutionary War. But we're going to talk about a little bit of what people need to understand was actually taking place in the state of what was the original 13 colonies and the entire then continent of America, how it was evolving. Understand at this time you still had like the French moving in from Canada down toward the Louisiana area. And then you had Spain, which was moving in toward the California area and Mexico area. Texas was its own nation, its own country, an independent country at the time. And Spain owned Florida at the time. And most of the south of North Carolina was controlled by what was known as the Tory, the King's men, who were the appointed governors by King George to manage the large developing farming plantations that were in the South. So this was the state. Understand, the original 13 colonies at this time of the true patriot Americans only existed within the original 13 colony area. These were the original settlers who were pretty much getting fed up with all this immigration of the French, the British, Spaniards, everybody coming in and around them. And they were feeling the pressure of everybody vying for a piece of the continent of America. And they realized that eventually they were either going to make a stand and take this nation themselves and establish their own country, or they were going to be overrun by all of these foreign immigrants coming in, or foreign world leaders trying to get their piece of America. And this is what was going on. The thing that we have to realize is that during, the breakout of, there's so much history that is related to, the thing with the breakout of America. The funny thing about it is that, it was in, I believe in 1770 was the initial start of what took place in the Revolutionary War. It was in Boston, where a free black man who was working in Boston as a rope maker was shot and killed by the British soldiers. Understand that what was going on the approach to the Revolutionary War, because that was in 1770, I believe, it happened in Boston. It was a free black man who was shot and killed by the Boston soldiers. Now, from 1770 forward, the presence of more British soldiers started to develop across the continent of America, and mainly would focus into that of the 13 colonies. The southern district areas of the farming plantations were pretty secured by the Kingsmen of the Tory. Britain understood that its main resistance of anything as far as what its plans were going forward was going to happen in the 13 colonies with the patriot Americans who had developed those colonies. And most of those colonies were developed in line to that of what the Declaration of Independence would come out to be, which I don't even have up, which is stupid. But we're going to pull that up real quick so I have it. And what it was, here we go, okay. We'll go back to this, and we'll see this as it's there. Okay, the Declaration of Independence, I was saying, when that was drafted, the 13 colonies were in line to what this was. This is what the 13 colonies had wanted. They wanted what was in the Declaration of Independence, and this was the mindset then of the original patriot Americans. So if you read the Declaration of Independence, understand, that was not the mindset of all people. They have, like today, these groups called the 3 percenters. Now, the 3 percenters were that made up of the colonist Minutemen. They were known as the Minutemen. And these men were the true American patriots. And that 3% of the whole entire population of the nation is what took on Great Britain and won the war. It was that 3% under the original colonies of the true American patriots. 3%. So I want you to think about that. Only 3 in every 100 people, or 300 of every 1,000 people in the time on the American continent would fight for freedom and to develop the nation of America. When I look back at this and I realize when you really take it in the numbers, I mean, you have these scrutiny people who want to say, oh, it was more than it was 3.5%. Look, the average was around 3% was what was concluded at that time from the consensus taking place, and that's the associated phrase to it. I understand it could have been 3.1 or 3.2. We're not going to nitpick about idiocy to try and derail off to things that off the subject of what we're looking for. That 3% population of, say, 3, or if you want to say 400 out of every 100, was the only people willing to fight for this country. The other 96 or 97% would have gone to their knees for King George III and accepted slavery by him enslaving the nation and doing what he had going on in Great Britain, and where we would have been enslaved under the rule of that of the elitist Tories and the royal families. As things progressed forward, and we would have just fell into the same trend of that of the rest of the world around us, is just being another continent of a totalitarian regime. But the Patriots weren't having it. And what most people don't understand, we have such a confounding history about lies, and the reason of the lies is mainly for today because of enemies within that have been long-standing since this country was founded. I mean, we're only 244 years new in this world. People may think that it's a long time. We have this long history, and the posterity, the children today, the young kids today, they think we've been here forever, and they don't realize we're one of the youngest nations in the world. We're only 244 years new in this world. And the majority of the world nations around us, of the totalitarian dictator regimes, have been around for thousands of years. Thousands of years. And these people know what they're doing, and that's what we're going to touch on, is what was the mindset and what was going on as we approached the Revolutionary War. One thing we have to take into consideration is that in the original 13 colonies, though the South was inundated with that of black African slaves because the Tories, King George of Great Britain had bought literally hundreds and thousands and millions of slaves that they had exported into the southern districts of the developing farming districts to labor those farms. And the Tory Kingsmen sat back as the governors overseeing these areas, just sat back and kind of controlled the slave labor going on for the production of the farming produce to be exported out for King George to make his money. But in the colonies of the original 13 colonies, all the way even back from the 14, 15, 1600s, slavery up in that area was mostly not so popular, and there was also a large population of free black Africans. Most don't realize, and they don't tell you in history because they try to keep things toward the agenda of what they want everyone to believe, but many black Africans as well who had wealth and means from Africa, because Africa at the time too was under constant invasion by that of the Islamic Muslims, because they were the dominant slave traders of the world, and their main primary product of slave trade was black African slaves. The Muslims pretty much controlled all of Africa and had forced most of the tribal leaders of South Africa to convert to Islam, and they left that of the population of the innocent tribal people as what they were, so they could enslave them and sell them around the world in the slave trade. So, many of those in Africa who maybe not were royal or tribal leaders, but understood the threat, as well as why most people came to America, because they understood the threat of the totalitarian regimes around the world. They, if they had the means, would come here too as indentured servants. There was many of them that came, and they worked through, like, Anthony Johnson, the Ellison family. These were well-known, large, free black citizens of that time that became wealthy and well-known in history. And we'll just put it at that. And these people were indentured servants, earned their freedom, and then became productive citizens in the 13 colonies. And the truth of up to 1777, in the 13 colonies, there was no racist issues. There was no issue between black and white. People coexisted and functioned and did their day-to-day tasks in labor and work and providing for their families as did anybody. There was really no issues there. Slavery existed in the South, and the racist issues existed with that of the Islamic Muslims. And, of course, the world in itself wanted to keep its own people to its own. Like Great Britain had a massive population of white slaves, of which we touched on a little bit in the last video, and I included a book in there, several books that people could read about what was taking place in that time with the white slavery going on in Great Britain, Scotland, and Ireland. Because they just didn't want to have the black African slaves there, and the same with Scotland or Ireland. They didn't want to have black African slaves, so they enslaved out of their own common poor people, men, women, and children. As you read those books that we include links in, and in the other page, you get an idea of what was going on. But in America, like I say, we're back to America. You have here as well, when the Revolutionary War broke out, many don't know that many of the free black Americans as well took with the Patriots. And then the sad part of it is, which we're going to get into this thing, when the Revolutionary War broke out, Great Britain had adapted that of what would be the ancient secrets of how these world totalitarian regimes are able to hold on to their powers for so many thousands of years. And we're going to look in today to where those things come from and try to grasp the idea of how long this ideology and practice have been ongoing in a world that is the cause of the world's totalitarian dictator regimes that keep humanity enslaved. And we're going to understand how what they did in that time and why they're trying to hide and twist the history so these things can't be noticed or seen or figured out. When we look back here in the Revolutionary War, we find out, that with just some quick notes, and I'll include links to these things here. Some of this is roundabout numbers, the same as what I say about the 3%. They say 5,000 black men served in the Continental Army. Okay, and at the time of when America in the Revolutionary War area, there was only about 460,000 black people in America, including slaves. There wasn't that large of a population yet, though millions have been imported over here from Africa. There was only so much needed population for what was developed in the farming districts for them to work, and over the millions would pass away over hundreds of years. We're talking from like the 1400s now to the 1700s, which is a like 350-year period. So over that period of time, yes, there was millions, but at the constant population state, it only existed between an average of maybe 300,000 to 500,000 tops of what would be on the continent at one time in any given year up to this point. It wasn't like millions of them all existing. The population was very low. And when you look at that and you look at the truth and you realize, in truth, which we'll get onto it, but we're going to move on to it. But anyway, I just want to say, there was many of those who were the free African and white people in the colonies that all together formed an alliance that took to that of the Revolutionary War. The population, of course, of European whites were greatly outnumbered that of the African blacks that were here, or any of the Jamaican blacks or what other blacks who came here from other continents at the time. But the African, right here, the African military slaves in the Muslim Middle East was where we're going to touch on. You see, now the issue with the Revolutionary War and the Tories in the South, today we hear about, many of the blacks fought against the Patriot Americans. That's not true. That's not true. In fact, the truth, if anyone was to look into the facts of truth, the methods that were by the Tories as well as the British kings are something that's ancient. It comes back from all the way in the time before the rise of Egypt even, with then the following, at that time, the ancient Babylonians. And like I tried to touch on a little bit in the past video that we just did on part 2, that there was geniuses in that time as well as there is in our time. And these men were able to figure out how to manipulate the psychology of humanity and control humanity. And they're the ones who came up with this order of smoke and mirrors with the ideas of a demigod, powerful rulers, dictators, supreme leaders, and what have you, in order to put themselves into a social status of living like kings on earth with everybody at their disposal to serve them in the capacity of a slave or that of a second or third class citizen, with that of what they would surround themselves with of a military and army to protect them and force people to do their will. And this is just the way the world evolved to that point. And when we look and we say, well, where did these things come from? They come from ancient time. But real quick, I just want to touch on here. This is something I'll include a link to so people can know. This is from 1780 to 1830. Populations of free blacks, slave blacks, white people, white slaves are not included in this, but you can get an idea of the white slaves in the books that we included in part 2. You can get an idea of what was going on there. But here, as you can see here, you had a population. This is estimates here, populations, and when you're looking across here, you see that this is of free slaves, population totals of 210,000. million people, whatever, in the division. There was only 53,288 blacks. Okay? And there was one, so you see 95.9% of the population was white. And there wasn't really that big of a number of black people in America at the time. And this, though, represents that of free. See, slave, free, black, and white. So understand that this was a population total. This is how many blacks. This is how many blacks right here, white, and what have you. So this is important to understand because it gives you an idea of understanding the actual reality that, because today people think like there was millions of black slaves all over. No, that's just not the case. There was millions of black slaves in the world because the Islamic Muslims have been trading in a black slave trade now for near 1,200 years on the time of the rise of America. And around the world there was millions of black slaves but there was also tens of millions of white slaves. Blacks were not the only people subject to slavery. This is a mythical lie. And this is just a propagated agenda to try and keep a divisive nature between that of races and skin color, which is idiocy. The truth of the facts speak for themselves, people. And what people got to understand is the reality of this. But we're going to go back to the point of what we're touching on about the Revolutionary War in ancient times of what was going on. This here we touch on with the Loyalists. Now, the British Loyalists were the kingsmen appointed by the kings of Great Britain to oversee that of the developing farming districts here in the continent of America. They were the holders of the largest slave populations in the southern farming districts. And that's not to say that, the northern colonies as well, all around. There was some areas that had abolitionism was something of slavery going on since the founding of this nation. They didn't want it in the 13 colonies. But all around those 13 colonies, like in Virginia, South Carolina, Maryland, New Jersey, there were people who had slaves. And, it was just a blending of culture and society of things that were accepting in that time all around the world. And no matter how much the rebellion against it, it would lead into, obviously, as we can see, a long fight that went on for 400 and something years here in America. But when we have the Loyalists, what the Loyalists did, in the time when America claimed its independence and we sent out the Declaration of Independence to King George III, the Loyalists rebelled against the Patriot Americans, and we wound up with a civil conflict of war going on right here on our own continent. We had to fight the Tory British Loyalists from the back door coming up out of the South, being loyal to Great Britain and trying to fight us, as well as dealing with Great Britain coming across the ocean and facing us from the front. So we had this, and then what the Loyalists did was they adapted, the same as what Great Britain suggested to them to do. Records of facts show this. And it was a method that was taken from back in the ancient times. Like, I just want to touch on some of the things here. Like, we have some information about things involving, too, the Indians in the Revolutionary War, and how, as well, they were used in the same sense of what was with the black African slaves. And why are we touching on these things? We're touching on these things because of where they come from. Right here, we're talking about Babylon. When you want to know where was the role of the black African slave in the Revolutionary War, it was the same as what they had been being used by the Islamic Muslims now for 1,200 years. The method of the Islamic Muslims for 1,200 years in the battles of their expansion of Islam and trying to take over world domination, they would go and enslave massive herds of black Africans and line them at the front of the military movement against the nation. And they would let the black slaves weaken the forces for them and literally have tens of thousands of them just running in to be slaughtered until they weakened the forces of the military of the nation or province or small state they were trying to overthrow. And once they realized that most of that military had been depleted and weakened by the African slaves being forced at the front lines to fight their battles for them, then they would ride in and play like the heroes of the conquerors. And in truth, it was just it's just an onslaught of innocent people being put to the front lines. They had no idea why they were fighting or who they were fighting. They just knew that people were trying to kill them and they had to fight for their own lives. And they were just used as a wall of weakness. That was it. And these tactics of using slaves as white or black or any slave, because also too, in the many of the movements of the Islamic Muslims, they didn't just use African slaves, they used white slaves as well. They were enslaving tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of Christians over the time period of 1,200 years as well. And any people who are not Islamic Muslims, no matter what their color, they would be enslaved. That was just the ideology of that foreign totalitarian regime. And the British had adapted that same form on the approach to the Revolutionary War. When we hear about the black Africans fighting for Great Britain and King George, understand that they were slaves who were of the Tories' control in the southern farming districts. And they would do exactly like what the Muslims were doing. They would use the slaves to frontline or an attack on that of the Patriots and to try and weaken the Patriot army for Great Britain. These were the things that caused the divisive nature on the basis of like white and black divisions. Many of the Patriots in the start of the Revolutionary War was a little bit confounded because in the north area, the 13 colonies where most of the Patriots came from, there was an alliance between white and black free people. And they had, though they knew and were very aware of the black slave trade going on in the southern farming districts, they were also didn't see it as a racial issue because they were also very much aware of the great white slave trade going on all along Great Britain and all the territories of Great Britain with the Irish and the Scottish common, as well as anyone of the Spanish common who could be enslaved and forced into the copper and brass mines or the farming districts in that continent because in truth, the kings of Great Britain and England and Ireland didn't want black African slaves, so they, like I said, they enslaved their own people. So the majority of slaves there were that of white European slaves. And, so there was no real, in that time, from the perspective of the Patriot colonists, there was no white or black issue. It was just a humanity issue of slavery. When you read back in the letters and the news and the things of what there was in that time, you'll see there's no mention of white or black as so much as that inhumanity. Slavery itself was on the chopping block for abolishing it for near 300 years in the founding and development of the continent of America, and it wasn't only directed at that of the black African slave, though that's all we seem to talk about in this time now is black African slaves, like as if they somehow have a market cornered on slavery, like they were the only people ever slaves. This is just not true. Matter of fact, in the founding of the first establishing of the continent of America, the first slaves brought here were of the common Irish and Scottish white slaves. And they say, and we hear about these things that are fabricated lies, that Washington, D.C. was built by black slaves alone. That's a lie, too. There was many, though I know a lot of them want to say, oh, well, that an indentured servant's a different thing. Then let me tell you something. Indentured servants who came over and were under the control of the British Tories never got freed. Never got freed. And there's records of facts of history that show there was many cases that even during the time of after the Civil War, that it was found that many tens of thousands of white Irish and Scottish commoners who came and were under the, because they would sucker them in. The Tories would sucker them in and offer them to an indenturement, but when they got here, they were never freed. And there was many blacks as well that happened to. We see that like with the cases of many court cases that happened with many blacks that came from Africa as indentured servants, and as well got grabbed up by the Tories in the South and were never freed. They went from indentured servants to being slaves all their life. This was just a common thing that happened back then. It wasn't because of a colored issue. It was a humanity issue. The Tories of the Great Britain were self-proclaimed elitist scumbags of inhumanity. They just thought that everybody below them, they were like royal, they had royal blood, and they were special elitist-minded people that thought anybody below them should be there just to serve them. That's just the mindset of these evil scumbags in that time. And like I say, today when I look at history and I see how people try to portray out how it is, it's a lies. It's just propagated lies of a twisted history used for the exact purpose of what ancient times says, to divide and conquer people. And that's what it's all been about. All these issues that we're facing today in America are built upon lies and fabricated, twisted history that's just not true. It's just not true. And we need to wake up to this reality that these methods were of ancient time, established by long-standing people. I'm going to include links so people can get an understanding. These things have been revealed through the codes of actual evidence that's been found in the ruins of ancient Babylon, though world governments, including the United States, doesn't want anybody really to be analyzing these things. Because if you were to analyze these things, and you would see the order of how the ancient Babylon worked with Egypt and the rise of what would be the first known kind of empires of kingdoms, or emperors or demigods, of controlling elitism, well, you would be able to say, hey, that sounds a lot like America, or that sounds like a lot like Great Britain. Or you'd realize all government forms are following this ancient pattern of being able to rule their nation, and maybe like you do have all the nations around the continent of America right now, and still to this day, vying for that of world domination and control. They want to rule the world. And this all starts back right prior to ancient Egypt. The order of, you see in these tablets, how they sustain, like here you can see, I just have some things I'll include, like you read about it and you realize that most of these Babylonian scrolls and things, when I was a kid reading these things and had many of them, I wanted to interpret it from the hieroglyphics into like a language where I could read them. And I was expecting to have like, Sinbad stories and things like that, but no. I was disappointed to find out that this was just like a hereditary guide that was given to the posterity of the pharaohs and the kings and whatever, but so passed on generation to generation of how to keep order in their rule, how to keep the kingdom, how to control the population, how to keep a military. It was an instructive guide to each generation, understanding how to rule as what it was established. And when you see it, you understand the psychology and the genius behind these people in ancient times. The whole thing with the uniforms, the ranks, were all developed back in ancient Babylon, and even back further to ancient Egypt. These things were tested and understood that if you wanted to be able to, like for instance, I'm just going to, so people can understand the mindset of where we are and understand that if from ancient time to today, though we've advanced in technology, humanity does not change and human nature does not change. And the application and principles of what's being applied by that of the world's totalitarian regimes has not changed for thousands of years. They're using the very same methods to control us today as they did 10,000, 13,000 years ago. And people just are blind to understand the reality of this unless you indulge deeply into that of world culture and history. But you see, the idea of ranks, uniforms, stripes, badges, all these things in different colors of markers, all started in ancient Egypt. And this was how the pharaohs were able to get that. Like you take, for instance, when you became a pharaoh, right? And then you got all these people of the Egyptians. How do you get the people who start rebelling under control when the very people that you have to count on are their family or their relatives or their friends? Well, you give them prestige. And this is written in the ancient scrolls of the Babylonians and the Egyptians of how you keep order of the kingdom. How they would bring in large ranks of the strongest, most boldest of men and give them prestige and luxury, give them a special uniform and with special colors and special rank that made them important people who the common people would have to respect. And this, of course, strokes the human ego. And then what happens is, like, you got a guy, he's got his big brass shoulders on, his hat, and he's got his spear, and, he's got his fancy clothes, and he's got a palace, little house inside the palace area, and his family's well taken care of, and he doesn't have to worry about nothing. And now he's out there, and, all of a sudden there's a couple people, and the Egyptians uprising, and they don't like the way the Pharaoh's treating them. And, he tells them guys, you got to go out. And he gets out there and he realizes these are his friends of his family, just hypothetically, kids he went to school with, blah, 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 whatever. And he doesn't want to hurt these people. And he goes back and tells the Pharaoh, look, those are my friends. That's a couple of them are my cousins. I mean, and the Pharaoh says, okay, well, give me back that helmet. Take off the helmet. Take off the brass. That's it. You're done. Who wants to take his position? And now you see there's a vying for authority, a vying for a position of status. There's a blow to the ego. Oh, are you going to take my helmet? You're going to take my rank? All of a sudden now humanity has to weigh, and each man, he's got to weigh where his morals and his values lie. This guy's pride and dignity and ignorance of pride will be his fall, because he'll want, no, don't, I will go deal with it. And then he'll go out there and he'll do what he's got to do to maintain his status. You see, they understood how to play the psychology of that. And these things, as we advance in time, we realize out of the ancient practice of ranks and order and status and position of class, all moved forward with time in the modernization of civilization, and is still being used this very day to control that of our populations, of our ranking and class of people within powers and authority, like the police with their little badges and their uniforms, and now we have them militarized and they look like warriors, and everybody's a sergeant, a major, a captain, whatever, And these are all things that, I understand. One, I don't want to take away from anybody in the military by their ranks of understanding the importance of that, shows their wisdom and experience. I don't want to take that away from you. I understand you got that. But I'm saying on how it's used in a manipulative way to control authority. Like you take, for instance, right now they have the National Guard, 30,000 troops out there. These guys all have a position of rank by their commanders, of which if they break or they refuse to follow orders, their stripes can be taken. Their rank can be taken. They can be demoted. And this is humiliating among their men. And these are the same practices as what I'm saying of ancient time was used, and the same in the Revolutionary War was used. Okay, this is how they got people to fight against people, was by positioning them in positions of status, making promises to them. Like you take, for instance, during the Revolutionary War, Great Britain had promised all the slaves who had fought for the Tories in America freedom. But in the end, they reneged. They all went back to Canada, or they went back to England thinking they were going to go back free blacks, and wound up when they got over there, they were re-enslaved and sold back into the slave market. It was reneged on. Some of them were actually boated out, the Tories, to the ships of the Britain to run back to Britain. They were trying to escape when they realized they couldn't win the war. The slaves would oar them all the way out to the ships, and then they would let all the white Tories on the ship, and then they would literally shoot holes through the boats and sink the boats and let the black slaves drown because they didn't have the food or the resources to even want to feed these people. So, it was horror, the stories, when you read the truth of what took place back then, in the evil nature of these self-proclaimed elitist scumbags that were ruling the world. And the reason I want to touch on these things is, like I say, we just need to get to the truth of understanding the state of the world at that time. Some of the things I wanted to get onto, I'm looking for right here. This is something that we need to consider and look at. When you realize this right here in the South, okay, and then in the North, what we had in reference to that of free slaves or free blacks and enslaved black Americans. When you look here and realize that the population differences that took place, the same as what you see where am I at? I'm trying, just bear with me here. And when you see in this here, you realize that the population differences between the states of North and South, of slaves and free, you can see the difference. You can see, because, understand that from the very beginning, as we touched on base, Thomas Jefferson had raised the issue of slavery, and a lot of people say, well, it's hypocritical because he was a slave owner himself. There's a lot of fallacy, and I'm not saying he's not a slave owner, I'm just saying there's a lot of fallacy to what the treatment of people were and the reality of what it was. Thomas Jefferson had purchased many slaves, not for the purpose of having them as slaves, but just to give them a chance at life in a sense of freedom. Like you take, for instance, everyone knows that he had a lover that was a black woman, and he had children with this black woman, and everybody knows that there was a time where she was out of the nation in a free continent where she couldn't be enslaved, and she returned and accepted the position as a slave to be with Thomas Jefferson because that was just the order of the way things were in that time. She wasn't really with him in Monticello as a slave. She was there as his mate, but he couldn't legally, under the laws at that time, because that was the order of the way things were, have it that way. So she had to play the role of a slave and what have you. And people, when you look at the reality of these things and you realize what was going on, this was the same way with many things. There was also, like, on average, the average free slave during the whole time of America, the average free black American owned himself between 1 and 5 black slaves. Now, we can cherry pick out and find the ones that were in the Virginia, New Jersey area who were buying slaves not for the purpose of actually enslaving them, but to give them freedom. Even though they couldn't free them, they would allow them to live among a land, because you had free blacks who owned many acres and plantations and farms, and they would actually purchase them as slaves, but give them a job, and they would give them a life, and they would work for them as like employees, but have to be under the status of slave because that's just the way it was in that time. And then there was also in the southern districts with the Tories, many free blacks who owned actual slaves that slave labored them and was just as inhumane as that any of the Tories and the British were. And the evil white of Europeans were, that had no humanity in them to the slaves. And like you look at Ellison or Anthony Johnson, these men, they were slave breeders. They bred slaves, and they were black freedmen who bred slaves, traded in slaves, sold slaves, and owned hundreds of slaves for their own plantations that they labored. So understand that, it's not a white and black issue, really. It's a humanity issue that people have to understand, because today, we're talking now, America's 244 years new, okay? And we're still talking about slavery from 160 years ago, of which at the time of 160 years ago, we were a nation divided of half free, half slave. Okay, and when you look and realize at the time of 1860, when the Civil War approaches, we have 19 free states that don't have the slavery is abolished, and you have the 11 or 13, it winds up being 13 of the Confederate slave states of the Democratic Party where there's slavery allowed. The nation was divided on this issue between the Tory Democrats and that of the colonist Republicans. The colonist Republicans wanted slavery abolished. And this is the other thing which we touched on in the last video, which I say, in the Revolutionary War, upon its starting in 1777, we see with the colonists how they, now that they were no longer under British rule and law, they started abolishing slavery, starting with the first state, Vermont, in 1777. And Vermont even gave the free blacks the right to vote, way before the Civil War even happened. But nobody considers these realities. Nobody considers either that upon the Revolutionary War, granted, I'll say that the majority of those of here captive white slaves were freed before the blacks, because it took all the way up until 1861 to get the whole of the black slavery abolished across the nation. And in the Revolutionary War, though as well in the northern colonies, all were free. And then too, there was many of the South who actually fled to that were white Irish indentured servants that were enslaved for decades down there. They were had to escape. They were escaping with the black slaves, and people don't even look back to recognize this in the history of how we see in New York and the records and things like that. We have as well many cases in where indentured servants of the Irish and the Scottish and even the Spaniard had made it up to after the Revolutionary War to like Massachusetts and said, I'm a runaway indentured servant, but I was a slave for 20 years. I was only supposed to serve 7 years, but they wouldn't let me go. And then a court would grant them their freedom. There's cases upon cases of this. It was not, like I say, a white and black issue. Nobody considers the opposition side, because history's been twisted in a way for a divisive nature to divide us. And I feel it's important that as we go into understanding the rise of America, that we understand the truth of the situation of that time, so that we can maybe destroy the inferior complex that keeps us divided right now on this racial issue of really lies, just basically right out lies. And as we progress, we're going to get to the point of understanding that the true America itself, of the United States of America, had nothing to do with slavery. It was nothing. America didn't found slavery. It wasn't the founders of the black African slave trade. Everybody assumes here, because of the way the twisted facts of history, that the black African slave trade started with the transatlantic shipping of slaves over here from Great Britain. That's just a lie too. The black African slave trade had started in 640 AD, 1200 years before the continent of America even started to develop. The Muslims invaded North Africa in 640 AD. They started the black African slave trade way, way back then. They're the founders of the black African slave trade. And the Islamic Muslims, in truth, of all honesty, which we're going to prove as we go along here, are the actual founders of racism. I've studied world culture and history now for, the majority of my whole life, since I was a very young kid. And I've been always fascinated with it, and all I care about is the truth. And, when I look over world history of the 13,000 years of written history of evidence that we have to where we can piece together what was actually the evolution of humanity in the last 13 years, or 13,000 years. Never prior to the Nation of Islam do I ever see, that's why to this day people don't know what color was Jesus. They don't know. They never mentioned it. They don't talk about color in the Bible. They don't talk about color in ancient history. You don't see anything about, this black guy or this white guy or this yellow guy or this red guy or this blue Eskimo guy. None of that was ever spoken about until the era of 640 AD, when the Islamic Muslims rose. They were the founders of white supremacy. They were the first white supremacists. And like I say, if you go to YouTube and you watch my video there, The Lies of the Nation of Islam, revealed unquestionably by the facts, though many of the Nation of Islam's black Americans today think that Muhammad was a black man, they don't realize, no, he was like Opie White. He was like Richie Cunningham. He had red hair, white, pale skin, He was a white man, and Islamic writings in history make it very clear he was a white man. Go watch my video, The Lies of the Nation of Islam, on YouTube. You'll get a reality wake-up to realize exactly where racism started. It started with the Arabian Muslims. And the Arab Muslims were just an elitist status. That was their position. Being they enslaved the black Africans in 640 AD. Of course, they had to see them as being below them, which they've seen everybody that way. These people are a totalitarian regime of elitist scumbags, the evilest of humanity that we know in this world that still exists to this day. And there's still actually slavery. I think I showed that in the last video. We touched on it a little bit about the slave trade markets that are actually still ongoing this very day, at this very time right now. In the Islamic states, there are actually slave markets where they're selling white Zidi women right now as sex slaves, black African slaves as labor slaves. You could buy a black African slave right now in Libya for $400, $300. So I'm not joking you. This is reality today, that obviously the black Americans totally ignorant to the reality of what's going on in this world today, because they're arguing about slavery that was taking place in the world in a time where they think they were the only ones who had the market capitalized on slavery, and don't realize they're just following propagated lies of being used as minions in a game of division that is keeping the American people from actually accomplishing the goal of America, to develop to that of the true one nation of one people of all equal. And they're playing by their ignorance into the very divisive nature of keeping us in the state we're in right now. I mean, they're being manipulated like total goddamn fools. They're total fools. I'm sorry, as a man who is self-educated in everything I know, and really didn't even start to attend school till I was near 13 years old, and I grew up in the ghettos of the city of Newark, New Jersey, I was able to, under the same circumstances and conditions, and I know they would say, oh, that's because you're white privilege. Look, you can kiss my American ass. I never had no white privilege, okay? Everything I earned and have in my life, I earned by my hands and my wisdom and my own devotion to that of my own wisdom and knowledge in obtaining what I could in this world to make it through this insane goddamn humanity, okay? Nobody gave me nothing because of my skin color. I've earned it all. And my customer base consists of that of all race, origin, national origin, and people. Indian, black, white, Polish, German, Jamaican, and you know what? They are all equal of one people to me. They're my customers. That's my family. They're the people who provide the food for me and the clothes on my back, the roof over my head. I don't give a damn what color they are. I care about the character of who they are, and they're all good people. Okay, and I don't look at that. So, and I don't want to hear this white privilege bullshit. Trust me, it's bullshit. You know, and the only, it's just an excuse. And you know, and until we dissolve the lies and we get to the facts of truth, we're not going to be able to move forward. And that's why we have the brakes on, and we're actually going backwards. Right now, we're repeating history. We're on a teetering line in the United States today to where we are at the point of what I'm looking at right now. The Revolutionary War. We're in a position right now where we could be facing the second civil war in this nation. And it's coming, people. It's going to happen. And as well, from what it's looking like in history, we are on the crest of World War III. Because the move by the totalitarian regimes is not just taking place in America. The corruption and the issues that are going on with the elections in America and the government in its form of order and abuse of powers and consented to authorities is what we're seeing right now in America. Is not just happening here, it's happening around the world. And that's because the same rulers who have been in control for thousands and thousands a year are now making a move to try and grab more land, more countries, and the one thing they all want more than anything is to destroy the nation of America. And I'll tell you what, people, one thing we need to wake up and realize, we're 244 years new in this world. These people, and I say this repetitively, and a lot of people say you keep repeating the same things, I get it, but understand the truth doesn't change. You're going to hear the same thing over and over. If I start changing up and I'm saying something about the same era and it's different, I'm lying. Because the truth shouldn't change. So yeah, you're going to hear the same thing repetitively over and over about these matters because the truth doesn't change. So I'm going to say the same thing. I get a lot of people saying, every time I hear you say that, that's because the truth doesn't change. It just doesn't change. It's going to be the same story. Okay? And when we look at these totalitarian regimes right now, they're vying for world domination and control still, as they have been for thousands of years. Understand what I just said, thousands of years. We're 244 years new in this world. These people have been doing this for thousands of years, and they're making a move. And that move, most times when it's made, is made at a time period that spans between 3 to 5 generational gaps, and usually leads to a world war, as we know from World War I, World War II. Prior to that, the world wars that were taking place between Great Britain, France, Spain, and the continent of America itself. Right here in our own nation, we had the wars with the Indians and whatever for the establishment of the takeover of these lands from that of who were the tribal primitive people prior. And so I'm just saying, when we get to the point here, understand that the United States of America in the founding had nothing to do with the issues today that are dividing this nation. America did not found the black slave trade. America was not the nation of slavery. It was the nation of ending slavery. The America of today, of the United States of America, was founded by the colonists of the original founding who did not want slavery and who claimed and formed their own nation within the developing continent of America. Understand that following the Revolutionary War, too, we continued on with a civil conflict, even after beating Great Britain, with the British Tory. The Tory still, so you'll understand this, the majority of all the lands that the Tories were controlling and governors for King George III, were in the southern region area. They were the farming districts, right? And in those farming districts, they controlled the majority of the slave population on the continent of America. After we defeated Great Britain, the Tories in the South, realizing there was nothing they could do, they went and claimed all those plantations in the South as their own property. And with that, they claimed the African slaves who were laboring that property as their slaves. They became the largest land farming district and plantation owners in the continent of America, and they became the majority slaveholders in the new developing nation of the United States, which hadn't developed it took 10 years for the founders who fought the Revolutionary War after we defeated Great Britain. We had to take 10 years to develop that of an ideology of what we would accept as our government. We claimed our independence in the Declaration of Independence, and then we took a 10-year period of considering and reviewing. That's what the Federalist Papers are about. And then we get up to 1788, 1789 area, where we drafted and we presented our Constitution and ratified it. And then we look at 1789, where we come up with the Bill of Rights and we ratify that. So it took that period to develop a government, an ideology of we would accept as a government to govern our nation for us. And we had formed a whole different type of government in the United States. We formed, and the Tories here is what we have. They were totally rebellious against us. It was civil conflict that never ended with the Tories. The British Loyalists and the Patriot Americans fought all the way up throughout all of our history, and still to this very day are, because the Tories of that time became the Democrats in 1828. They were the ones who formed the pro-slavery Democratic Party in 1828. So understand, and we're going to continue on forward with that, but I just want to make people aware that when I say that we have these same conflicting issues going on since the very beginning, understand that they just changed the names, but it's the same people causing the inward problems right now that have been causing it from the very start. Now, the Tories, being the majority of slaveholders, of course, didn't want to give up slaveholding, and they continued in a rebellion against the Patriot Americans from the Revolutionary War forward. And these are things that we have to accept and realize. We also have to accept and realize the reality that with the Tories, they followed the ancient codes of what was known to be able to overthrow a nation or dominate that nation by what was being given and handed down by Great Britain. Great Britain, as well as China and all these other nations, Arabia, the kings of Arabia, the kings of Great Britain, the kings of Egypt, all these people were ruling by that of the ancient method still to this time. The Tories were loyal to that of Great Britain and loyal to the king, and they were doing all they could to destroy the Patriots' goal of this this idea of a free nation. And there was like I said, civil conflict continued for a long period. There was, the Tories were hanging the Patriots when they would catch them. The Patriots were tar and feathering and hanging the Tories. That's what the one image I have. I'm looking for it. I'm trying to find this one image. Here it is, right? You see here the Loyalists with the hanging. Understand, the Civil War was a long span of war. Most of us think the Civil War started in 1861. I got news for you. The Civil War was going on since 1776 forward with the Tories. It was only in 1828 they formed the Democratic Party. And then it would be some 33 years later that they would actually cause what we call the Civil War, without realizing that Civil War was waging the whole time. It was just at that point that it came to a bloody, divisive, that we had allowed this enemy within to build itself up and control a region of the nation, and where they were able to build up an army and actually positioned for an overthrow of the United States. And on the whole progression of that, we get to a point where we realize that they were progressing that the whole time along, because when we take a look at the Tories and we realize what was going on, and we look at the wars that took place. For instance, we had the first war as an independent nation was in 1801 against the Islamic Muslims. The Islamic Muslims back then were allied with the Tory because of the slave market and the slave trade. The majority of the slaves being purchased by the Tories, though in I think it was in 1809 and 1810, America, the United States, had banned the importation of slaves. So the Tories would then have the ships of slaves brought in by the Muslims off the coast of Florida, because Florida was still owned by Spain, and they would go out and get the slaves from that point. There was an alliance. The slave trade was big money for the Islamic Muslims out of the American continent as well, with the Tories in Great Britain. The reason that the Islamic Muslims really took a rebellious position against the new developing nation of America, the United States, was because they were crushing their slave trade. Because, you know, it was being abolished across the nation here in America. And as we see that when we had the War of 1801 with them kidnapping our people, imposing a tax on us. The reason of this prior didn't happen was, one, the jizya tax was being paid by Great Britain to keep them off everybody's neck. Two, they never really made a move against anything with the developing nation of America because they were making muco bucks in the slave trade. They were the primary provider of the black African slave in the transatlantic slave trade. So, you know, when America, the United States, developed and started abolishing slavery and banning the importation of slaves, this really affected the Islamic Muslims, hit them right in the purse, because that was their market. They were the world dominant, predominant one dealing in slavery. They were a slave nation. So in 1801, we had the issue with them where actually George Washington prior was forced to pay the jizya, because we didn't have a navy, we didn't have the forces, and we were pretty depleted from the Revolutionary War. So we were forced, literally extorted, and had no choice. But by the time of the War of 1801, we had developed enough of a navy that we could make a presence known, and we got things established. But it was also known, too, that these people were declared our enemies at that time, in 1801, and even prior by George Washington. They were considered the enemies of worldkind, all the world, of all mankind, by George Washington. And we would again face another war with them, but first we would face the Second Revolutionary War of 1812, and that's where I want to go to now, the War of 1812, and understand how long-standing the Tory were in their goal to overthrow the United States and their allegiance to Great Britain. When we look at the War of 1812, most people don't know. If you indulge into the history, you'll find that this war, where Great Britain had attempted to overthrow again the United States and take control back, was mainly orchestrated and led by that of the British Tories in the southern farming districts. Slavery was being abolished drastically up to this point. The importation of slavery had been banned. The Tories had understood that and realized that if things kept progressing the way it was, they were going to lose control. They were like the enemies within up to this point of 1812, always in alliance with that of Great Britain and the foreign nations, never an alliance. They were never American. They never agreed to America. They never agreed to the American principles. They didn't want the Constitution. They totally were opposed to the Constitution. They were opposed to a federalized central government, and they did all they could to disrupt the forming of the nation of the United States of America. And they were totally against and hated the Republicans of the Free Republic of the Constitution of the United States. They were the resistance point that caused all civil upset and civil issues going on and fighting and battling during that time, from the time of the Revolutionary War right up to the War of 1812. They were instigators and involved with that of allies to our enemies the whole time, and doing all they could to try and overthrow this country or make this country collapse. This is no joke. They have always been the enemies within. In the War of 1812, when we were being attacked by Great Britain again from the front line, of which, if you look back and you study, the War of 1812 is where our national anthem comes from. That was by the guy who wrote the national anthem, and it was over witnessing the attack of the War of 1812. He was a lawyer. Francis T. Scott is the lawyer who wrote the poem of what became our national anthem from the War of 1812. And it's a heroic battle that takes place and where that poem comes from and that national anthem. And that's why it should never be disgraced in any way in this country. It plays an important role in our history of who we are and the morals and values of who we are as the American people, of the true American. And disgracing that flag is just a disgrace of anybody in this country, and we the American people, allowing these people to disgrace our flag and our national anthem as we are, is even more disgraceful. We should be ashamed of ourselves for tolerating this kind of ignorance in our nation. To anybody who knows the truth about the history of it, understands that every person taking that knee and acting a fool like that is a totally ignorant asshole who should be really deported out of this country. If you don't like it and you want to do it, and you're so ignorant that you won't even take the time to understand what you're doing, you should be exiled out of this country. And then you'll realize what you had for such great blessings. You bunch of ignorant goddamn assholes is what you are. Really disgraceful. But anyway, back to where we are in the subject. I get upset about these things, as you could tell. But in the War of 1812, the British Tories were the ones who aligned with that of Great Britain in an attempted overthrow again of America. We realized this in more great in-depth detail afterward but the problem was also too, in the discovery of the history, we realized that the Tories weren't so bright. And mind you too, back then you didn't have cell phones, you didn't have cars, everything was horseback. And there was no telephones, if you wanted to communicate to somebody, you gave a letter to somebody, wrote it on a horse for months to get it to them, and then they would write a letter and months to get back. A text back then could take 6-7 months or even a year for a text to get back and forth, because it was written and delivered on horseback. This is the reality. So they really didn't have, and being they mostly stayed in the southern hemisphere of the newly developing nation of the United States, they had no idea of the advancements and growth of the northern areas like New York and Philadelphia, and how massive our military had grown. They had given a lot of misinformation to Great Britain, and Great Britain was under the assumption that we had not really advanced that much. And but we were in the process of advancing, because we already knew that we had again turbulence happening out at sea with our ships being kidnapped again by the totalitarian Islamic Muslims. They were breaking the treaty of the 1801 agreements that were made, and feeling powerful as well, probably by that of the instigation of Great Britain as well, because the Tories and Great Britain and the Muslims were all in alliance with overthrowing the United States of America. None of these foreign totalitarian regimes or monarchies cared for the United States of America, and there was nothing more they wanted than to see this nation fall. So you had the issue of where the Muslims were providing massive shiploads and now with their advancements themselves and using slave labor, manufacturing gunpowder, munitions, and what have you, and supplying that to the Tories and through the South out of Spain, making sure they were well armed for the war that was coming of 1812. And we found out these things. But like I said, the misinformation given to Great Britain about the size of the Navy and the military that it was developing along the United States within the upper 13 colony area, Britain had no idea what it was up against, and realized that that's why it was a short-lived war. They retreated quickly when they realized there was no way they were going to defeat America. Not to mention, too, both in the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, we had as well allies who allied it with us. Back in the War of 1812, we had the alliance of what would be modern-day Australia and as well Russia. Russia was in a line in the Revolutionary War and as well in the War of 1812. Russia had informed Great Britain that they were going to take an alliance, and that was another reason. They realized with the massive military development that took place in the original 13 colonies during the War of 1812, that if Russia came in as ally, they would definitely have no chance. So they retreated, and the war was shortly, it was a quick war over and done with. But the Tories, they continued to stay. The Tories just backed off back into their area, down in the southern districts of the United States, and continued on progressing with what they want. We get to the point after the War of 1812 where we see in history, and you read the newspapers, you can see that they had started to do like a political campaigning and trying to sway the northern states that were abolishing slavery not to abolishing slavery, laying out everything they could to try and deter people from wanting to do this. They were trying to hold on to the slave trade. They wanted to keep slavery. In 1828, it would be the Tories who would form the pro-slavery Democratic Party. Now, the video's going on. We're going to leave off at this point with this point, so we leave off with the point of where the Tories are forming the Democratic Party in 1828 as a pro-slavery party to protect out of slave owner rights and to fight for the political right to be able to expand slavery across the developing nation of the United States. In that time now, around 1828, we have 15 free states and where slavery has already been abolished. We have the area now with the Louisiana Purchase taking place in every areas now that we're developing a new territories under the authority of the United States government, which was founded in 1789 with the Constitution. We had formed our government. We got to back up a little bit. I jumped ahead when I forgot to touch on this. We have the Declaration of Independence, and now we hit to the point of 1789 where we have our Constitution. And then 1789 we also have our Bill of Rights. The Tories were opposed to this, but now the United States is actually the United States. We have the Constitution. The United States Constitution was drafted by the people as the consensual authority, what we would allow for a government. The Tories didn't like it because it was a non-authoritarian government, one that was not established with authority over the people, but is like a service to the people. This was a whole new form of government, and this is where we're going to lead off to. At the time of approach to 1828, with the forming of the new government under the Constitution, the Tories had figured out a way that they could somehow infiltrate this new government, and they formed in 1828 the pro-slavery Democratic Political Party as an opposition to that of the Republican Abolitionist Party that was taking place. We're going to leave off right now with where we're at on this point, where we just get through the point of recognizing that the Constitution is developed. We're going to pick up on that point on the next video. I hope the history we gave you up to this point here, like I say, I understand it's broken up, but it's to give, understand, there's no way I can in one video give the perspective of a worldview on what our position was through these times. And these things all play an important role because, understand, the misconception and misunderstanding of these things today are playing an important role in the circumstances we're facing right now. And if we don't correct the truth of history and eliminate the racial issues and the immigrant division issues of what is the cultural issues of what's dividing us now, because understand, it was the confoundment of the time then. If we look at the truth then, we realize that we can see the lies of today. That's what I'm saying. If we can understand the true state of the world and our evolution, our evolving into the United States of America in that time, and understand that there was really no black and white issue, no racial issue. Slavery was something of a common practice among white, blacks. Everybody was under the subject of slavery, no matter who you were. And that today, what we are being told and what is dividing us as a people is lies. It's just it's blatant out lies. It's and what we're fighting over and dividing each other is actually keeping us in a position today that is keeping us divided in the hell that we're suffering under, while this government sits in the backdrop causing they're manufacturing all this lies. They're the ones who manufacture all this social divisiveness. They're the ones who manufacture all the social upset and civil fighting going on right now with white, blacks, legal immigrants against non-legal immigrants, against legal immigrants, nationality, origin, Indians, you name it. Any way they can divide us as a people, they're doing it. And the ignorance of people who want to hold on to these ancient or long ago, I mean, like you take, for instance, let me ask you something. Any black American right now that is holding on to, like, it would be like for me, do I want to, like, because I have Persian descent and I have, a European, I guess, Persian, whatever, Irish, whatever, I don't have Irish in me, but a Persian descent, right? Do you really think, like, would it be appropriate for me to go back and, like, put on a Persian kilt and a Persian helmet and have a spear, be like, I want to be a Persian. I want to be a Persian. I want to be a Makhmanid. No, I'd look like a goddamn fool. And you can't tell me right now that any black American or black person in the world right now wants to go put on a grass skirt and be a tribal African again. No more than you can tell me that any red Indian wants to go and, maybe they do. I guess they do because they have been long-standing and wanting to do this in their ignorance of avoiding the advancements of technology and the great blessings of God in our understanding now as we evolve into but obviously human nature isn't evolving when you look at these people. They still want to ride horses and wear grass skirts. What can you do about that? That's, but they really don't. It's ignorance of just total hypocrisy when you look at the truth of it. Like the black American who wants to put on the African, all this, they want to put that, but they don't really want to go back to Africa. They don't really want to go back to, and if they did, they'd find out their own black African people there would be enslaving their ass and selling them to the Muslims. They don't even understand the reality of what the world outside the borders of America are, or the great blessings of what they have being an American. They're just ignorant, totally dud-to-dud idiots that never even consider reality. They just go along with what fits their agenda of their poor me, woe me, oh, sorry, me person. The same thing as the American Indians do. Same thing as a lot of people do of ignorance, you know, and it's just the way it is. But reality is reality, and we need to face that reality if we're ever going to mend the wounds that are keeping America bleeding and a threat right now to our freedom and liberty. Because I got news for you people. What I'm telling you right now, and as we evolve, which I hope there's time for it all to come before things do hit a point of blowing up, because we are on the crest of civil war, and we are also on the crest of world war, and nobody's paying attention to what's going on around the world or right here in America. If you think that the massive mobs that took a move on January 6th in Washington, D.C., and what most people still seem to be totally unaware of, that move also took place among many state capitals across the country in different states. There was literally millions of people making a move across this country in the attempt of wanting to just remove this government. They've had it. The American people are disgusted, fed up. Those are the true American people of white, black, red, yellow, green, or whatever damn color. Those are the true patriotic, conservative Americans that understand the truth of all national origins and all foreign origins and all colors are unified and realizing the reality of what's going on here and what I'm telling you. There is a large, massive population of the minority of that of blacks that are conservative Republicans that understand the truth of it, and they're not buying the BS anymore. And there's that massive, true base of white Americans who are not buying that anymore. And a unified people is developing. And right now, that unified base of people is growing across this country. And those people are aware, very aware of the reality of that America right now in the current state is a banana republic. We have lost our ability as the people to control our government and our nation, and we can't allow that. We just can't allow that. And that reality is in the face of a lot of Americans, millions of Americans across this country right now, who are progressively trying to figure out what they're going to do about that without having a really bad situation. But the truth of the matter, too, is as well, with many of those former military and historians and people who are looking at this and realizing we are in the crest as well of a World War III breaking out. Because when you look at Donald Trump's administration over the last 4 years, and I'm going to leave off this, I know it's off subject, so in the end of it, we've ended the history thing, we're into the review right now of current times and how it's affecting us and how these matters of history do play into that. The battle for destroying America has been waging from the world right now for the last 244 years. They don't like this nation. The world totalitarian regimes of the terrorist organizations of inhumanity have been uniting themselves in a quest to go ahead and shake up the world and to try and cause a disruption. The Islamic Muslims are the primary base and have been for the last 1,400 years, being used as that of the warrior base of what goes in and instills the fear. You have the European liberal of that of the United Kingdoms and other liberal nations like Germany, small little countries, that are pushing for the indoctrination of liberalization and defeminizing men to take the warrior spirit out. These are all practices that have been long in practice for centuries, of which those who are aware of these things military-wise in the United States see what's going on and know what's coming. We are on the crest again of World War III. Because when we realize, too, right now, Canada has been under siege by that of the world's totalitarian regimes. There's a lot of issues going on in Canada with infringement upon people's rights, of which they're realizing as a democratic democracy, they really didn't have any rights. It was all a fallacy all along. They fell for the scam. The same is what we're finding out right now in Great Britain, like you see with the Tommy Robinson issue and the free speech, the laws and the issues being issued by Parliament where people can't speak about certain things. Or speak about certain people who are invading their nation and overthrowing their nation from within, of which right now the Queen and the Parliament and the government of Great Britain seems to be on board with, because you know what? They want to maintain their control as a democratic democracy over their people too. They've been fooling their people now for the last 244 years and playing ally to America, when in truth they have never been an ally to us. And I'm telling you right now, people, outside of the possible potential of a civil war here in America, we are facing the potential of very soon coming a world war around the world. Because, again, people might not be aware, in 1978, Iran was known as Mini-America. The Iranian people then were free people, just like America, and had a constitution near verbatim to America. And there are many, hundreds of thousands, if not several million people in Iran who still remember what it was like to be free. They still remember what it was like to live under a constitutional republic, and where they were free and they had rights and freedom of speech and liberty to do and pursue their happiness, unrestricted as like that of America. We were allies in that time before the Islamic Muslims overthrew the Republic of Iran. But the Democrats allowed that.
Jimmy Carter was Democrat, president at the time. He did nothing to aid and assist our then allied Iran when the Muslims invaded and overthrew them. The Democrats let it happen because, as I said, when you realize it was the Democrats in 1828 formed the Democratic Party, was the Tories. They have been the enemies within since the founding of this nation. And their goal is still the same goal as what it is. And as we progress in the history sect of things, we're going to understand that that goal has never changed and how we can relate to it and see it right up to this very day. They're still on the very same agenda. And the front of what we see is the Democratic Party, and that of the fools, of the ignorant of the Democratic voting base, are so ignorant because they're just as ignorant as the black majority of Americans in this nation that don't even know the truth of history. These people become Democrats without even understanding the truth of that political party and its ideology, of the facts of who they really are and how they're still practicing that very ideology today and using the same terrorist tactics they've been using since the founding of this country against that of the true American patriots. And things are about to heat up here, I think, pretty soon because organization across this country has taken place of the true Americans, and this government is very aware of it. The fortification of Washington and the continuing fortification of Washington is because intelligence is very aware, and as well the intelligence that is aware and informing them are becoming more and more aware that of their own intelligence as well exists of that of the many American people who have had it, and they're realizing day by day that the very forces they think are going to protect them are the very forces against them. So we hope that eventually it comes to a peaceful resolve more so than an ugly resolve. But this is the truth, the facts we're facing. But I'm going to leave off with that. This is what we had today about the understanding of where the ancient tactics came from, the methods of who are the enemies within, and our position of where we're going to leave off is on the approach of understanding. We're going to pick up on the next, and I understand a lot of this is confusing for people. And the understanding of this video was to give us an understanding of the approach to the founding of America. Though I jumped ahead a little bit, going to the Democrats in 1928 being formed, or 1828 being formed, and I talk a little bit about going ahead to the War of 1812, and these things jump over the point of actually America establishing. It's just to lay the groundwork so you understand that at the time of who these people were and how, as we progress now into the forming of America, how these people still continue to play a role in being the interfering factor of instigating civil upset, division, and the issues of what we face very much today is the same as what we did then. So in the next one now of the video I'm going to do, which will be, I think, part 4, we're going to actually just focus on the developing of the Constitution and then just that of history, and because I think I've done enough to explain to people of how the world was in that base so you understand on that. I think from the Constitution forward now, we'll just focus on American history and what took place and tie in what was taking place around the world then as it actually evolved from that point forward. So it should get less confusing for those as in the next video going forward, because it'll be strictly on American history from there out. I think we covered enough to what the state of the world was at that time. So with that, if you watch my video up to this point, I'll include links to everything that we have here so people can do their due diligence in studying things to try and get an idea of understanding who we are and what I'm talking about. And you can tie these things together to understand how these things all play a role in what we're facing again today. I'll leave off with this one statement though. Understand, though, the advancements of technology have greatly improved, and we have things now of which would have seemed impossible in ancient times or even just recent modern times of 100 years ago. But understand, human nature hasn't changed, and the names of things have changed. But the very people for thousands of years who have been controlling the world, enslaving humanity, haven't changed. They just changed the names of themselves to mask themselves to who they are. And we're still facing the very same situations we've always been facing. And when we can understand the truth of that, and we as a people can stop looking at things through the eyes of what they're manipulating us to see with the divisive nature of color, origin, immigrant, nationality, such and such, and we can see that we are the people of America as one people of all equal. This is our country, and we understand the outside influence and the enemies within themselves who are trying to destroy our country of who we are as the American people. And we can come unified as that people. We can stop this. And we can emerge from this greater than we ever imagined. And we can make our ideology of who we are as a true American people, of one people of all equal, something that could be contagious to the world in wanting. and what is to come now, soon coming again, may lead to that of the greatest evolution of humanity in all of our history. We'll have that to see yet. The chapter still to be written. With that, thank you all for watching my video. If you took the time to watch it and listen to me to the very end, I'll see you on the next video. And the next video will pick up on that of the coming of our Constitution and the actual birth of the United States of America. Thank you all again for watching my video. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you on the next video.